Hi, and welcome back to Glassboxed, writing automated Protractor tests. Today we're going to pick up where we left off and have a look at the configuration file. We will then write a test using Protractor in JavaScript and see how our test behaves when we run it using Protractor. So let's have a look at our configuration file first. So to look at the configuration file, because they're just JavaScript files, I'm just going to use Notepad++. Notepad++ is just a text editing program. There are obviously various others. You can use Notepad on your Windows machines, which comes as part of your Windows machines, or just install whichever text pad you really want. For this particular tutorial, we won't be using an IDE as such. So let's begin. Let's locate the configuration file. So we know that the configuration file ends up under users, and then it goes into this app data folder, which is a hidden folder usually, and then in roaming, and then it's under npm node modules Protractor example, and then conf. So this is the configuration file that is generated when we install Protractor. So let's go through this configuration file and try and understand what each one of these lines actually means and actually does. So for the most part, the configuration file is used to run tests against. So in our previous tutorial, one of the last things we did was we actually run a test by typing in Protractor space conf, and the conf was the name of this configuration file. So what happens when you run tests through Protractor is we actually pass in a configuration file into Protractor's runner, which then, based on what's in the configuration file, runs your test. So something else to note is that when you install Protractor, Protractor actually comes with a test runner, and it is in this test runner that we pass in this configuration file, which then picks up the relevant test. So this will become a little bit more clear once we've gone through what's actually inside this configuration file. So the first thing is the Selenium address, or in other words, when you actually run your WebDriver manager, it goes to this particular address, i.e. it's running locally on port 4444. So this is how it knows which Selenium WebDriver manager to use to run the test. Then moving on to capabilities. Capabilities is basically options we use for our WebDriver instance. So in this capabilities, which comes by default, all we're saying is we're going to run our test in the Chrome browser. So nothing too complicated there. Moving on to specs. Specs is basically the destination or the directory where we have our tests contained. So in this example, as part of downloading Protractor and installing it, we get all of this again provided to us. But here we say example_spec.js. So what that means is when we run, or rather when we pass this configuration file, it's just going to run this test. Naturally, we can change this to whatever. We can say, for example, my test, and this will run my test. Similarly, if you put in a wildcard, i.e. the star icon, this will now use this as a wildcard to match any possible characters which come prior to _spec.js. So you can use this to run multiple tests if you want. Now since we will write our own test, I'm just going to create a new test, and I will call it zoo. So I'll call it zoo_spec. This file doesn't exist at the moment, we will create it. Finally, Jasmine node options. These are just options which are more relevant perhaps to the console than the actual test. But here what we're saying is we're just setting in a couple of variables. We're setting show colors to true, which basically allows us to see the test outcomes a little bit more colorfully, and the default timeout interval to 30,000 milliseconds. which is basically us saying if the test doesn't run within this amount of time, then fail the current test and move on to the next one. It's basically our test timeout. So going back, this is what we pass in when we run Protractor, i.e. the configuration file. So now that we've gone through each line, it should make a little bit more sense in what this actually does. In essence, what it does is it sets up which browser we're trying to run our test against, where our tests are, and various other options. So the next thing we're going to do is actually start writing a test. So let's do that. So I'm going to call this, I'm going to call this zoo_spec. The reason I've called it zoo_spec is because I've said here the test I want to run will be called zoo_spec. So now when this configuration file is passed into Protractor, it will pick up this test. So let's begin actually writing our test. Now this test will be a basic test, and we're going to start from scratch. But before we do that, let me show the test site that we're going to actually run our test against. So this is my blogging site called the test room. This is where I'll be uploading all of my videos as blogs. It also gives you the opportunity to subscribe to my channel through my blog if you want to. But we're more interested in the test site that we're going to actually automate against. So if we go to the very bottom, we've got two test sites here. The Java test site, which I typically use for my WebDriver or RSpec automation videos, and this JavaScript test site, which is a brand new test site that I'll be using as part of my Protractor automation videos. So go ahead and click on the JavaScript test site link. That will now take you to this website, which is much more JavaScript catered than the Java catered. Anyway, so this is the site that we'll actually be automating against. And our automation test isn't going to do anything too fancy because this is supposed to be a basic test. All we're going to do is we're going to navigate to this page. We're going to type something in here. So let's just say test text, and we're going to have it printed here dynamically. So if I just do that again, if I get rid of it, it gets rid of the text. So if I say dynamic text, it prints out dynamic text. And our test is just basically going to navigate here, punch in some text, and then check the value of this generated text. So something else I want to do really quickly is just have a quick look at this page source. So right click, view page source. So this page source, the stuff I'm interested in really is some kind of identifier for this input field and some kind of identifier for this generated text field. And this data is actually here. So if we were to compare, if you like, if you have a look here, this is where the paragraph starts. Thank you for your interest in adopting one of our lovely zoo animals, which is basically here. So by definition, this input tag here is looking at this input box here. This also means this dynamic text box here is this H2 heading here. So why am I showing you this? Well, for those who write tests in, say, WebDriver in Java or RSpec in Ruby, there's this concept of identifying elements on a page using some kind of, well, identifier. Usually that translates into some kind of attribute for your tags. Now Protractor has this similar concept of trying to find something by an attribute. So for this input field, this has an attribute. This has two attributes. It's got an attribute of type with the value of text, and an attribute of type ng-model with the value of person.name. If we have a look at the attributes for this dynamic text that's generated here, it's ng-bind, which also has a value of person.name. So these are the attributes that we'll be using to identify these two particular elements on the page and then automate against it. So let's go back to our test. So what's the structure of a Protractor test? Well, usually a Protractor test starts off with what's called a describe block. So let me write this out. Describe. The describe block is used to describe the tests that go inside it, and it's really no more complex than that. That is pretty much the reason and the purpose of the describe block. It acts as a container to contain tests relevant to what it is that you're trying to test. So in this case, if I said that what we're trying to test is basically to input some text into that input field and see it generate some text, I can name my describe block something that fits to that purpose. So I can say test zoo site for input field on homepage. Then you do a comma and you type in function, open braces, close braces, and then open curly braces, close curly braces, and then your closing braces to finish off, to close off the first open brace, and then semicolon. So this is basically what's known as a describe block. All this says is the test that will go inside this describe block will be to test the zoo site for input field on homepage. Now where do you actually put your test? Well, see this function part of this block here, this is where your tests go. And to put the test, what you need to do is you need to hit enter just after the first curly brace. Now, like I said, this is just a describe block. This isn't where we actually put our test. Our tests go into a different type of block entirely, and they're called the it block. So if I say it, this is where we would write our test. The it block in structure is almost exactly the same as the structure of the describe block. So if we said it, and then, like I said, the it block is the actual block which actually does the test. This is what our test would be. So I would write some information here relevant or rather specific to the test. So in this test I would say to test input field and check text output. Right. So let me explain again. So this is a describe block used to describe the test, and this is the it block which contains the test. A describe block can contain multiple it blocks. So I can have another one if I want. I can do this if I want. A describe block can also contain another describe block if you want. So you can actually have this if you want. So some might say, hold on, why have the ability to have a describe block in a describe block? Why have the ability to have an it block outside the describe block and then more it blocks inside the describe block? Well, think about it for a bit. A describe block is used to describe its tests or the contents of its test. An it block is the actual test. So if you think about it, if a describe block has another describe block, then what you're basically doing is making your test a lot more specific. So I haven't actually populated, but if I just give a really quick example, if I say something like input field tests, and here I can say something like happy values, and maybe another it block which can say unhappy values. So this describe blocks now ends up containing tests which are much more specific and much more granular to what we're trying to test the input field for. The reason why we have the ability to have a describe block in a describe block almost acts as some kind of granular test, almost like some level of abstract test suits. But let's not get into that as such. The main thing to understand here is we have the ability to have a describe block in a describe block if we want. So let's go back to our test. So what are we trying to do in our test? Well, the first thing we want to do is access this particular input field, pass in some string, and then check to see that the string was populated inside this h2 tag and that we have an output. So let's do that. So how do we do that on a page? Well, if you have a look, this has an attribute of .ng-model. So it's this model that we're interested in. Similar to WebDriver, where WebDriver provides us with various different types of locators. For instance, find something by ID, by class, by tag name, so on. Protractor has this similar approach where it allows us to find something by some ID. And we can do that by simply saying element, open curly braces, by dot model. Then we pass in the value of the model. In this case it was person.name. Close it off. And then we can use the send keys method. The send keys method is used to send keystrokes to the input field. And in here we can provide some value to send to the input field. So in this case I would say I will subscribe to this channel. Right. So what this will do is this will locate the input field by searching for it by model and then seeing if it's got the value of person.name and then send keys to it. In this case we will send I will subscribe to this channel. The next thing we want to do is we want to get this binding, and that's similar in how we get it. Element by binding person.name dot get text. This will now get the text of that element. But like we said, we want to just make sure that the text we get is what we put in. So we can do that by continuing this and using a then command on this. So we can say then function. Inside the function we're going to pass in this get text. So in this case we're just going to say text. And in here we're going to say console.log text. So what does this mean? What does all of this mean? This .then magic. Well, here where we said element, find something by binding, and the value we're looking for in the binding attribute is person.name, and then get text. What that will effectively do is find this element, since this is the only element on the page which has a bind attribute with this value. It would get whatever values inside this h2 tag. In this case it will be whatever we put in into the type box, and it will get the text. Once it gets this text, in Protractor, or rather when we write these kind of describe it tests, we have the ability to use this .then function on almost anything to further extend what we're trying to do as part of this element method. So in here when we say .then, we can now chain on and do more things. Here we can use the .then to then run a function to which we pass in text. Text is the result of get text. So in this case it will be whatever's inside this h2 tag. And we're just going to basically do a console.log text, which is exactly the same as saying print out the value of text. There is one thing we haven't done though. We've said we're trying to get this input field. We've said we're trying to get the text, but the one thing we haven't said is actually navigating to our browser or navigating to our URL. And to do that, we just say browser dot get http www.testroom.com/JS web app. And this will navigate to the URL. What it basically does is when our test runs, it opens up an empty Chrome window. It will then navigate to this URL or to this address. Once it goes to this address, it will look for this element by using the .model attribute, which has a value of person.name, and send this key to it. Once it's done this, it will look for the h2 tag and identify it by its binding attribute, which also has a value of person.name, get the text, and then print the text out. So let's save this and run it. So let's start our WebDriver manager first. that to a side. And then we're going to navigate to the directory where we wrote our new test. Oops. In here, we're going to do a quick directory listing. So what we want to do is pass this new configuration file into our test. So we're going to type protractor conf and run that. And it looks like our test ran successfully. It picked up one test, 0 assertions and 0 failures. It also printed out what we passed into the text, i.e. I will subscribe to this channel. So what have we done in this video? Well, the first thing we did was we actually looked at the configuration file and tried to understand it. We looked at each section, and the only change we made was to the spec section to point to a new test which we wrote. In the test we wrote describe blocks and it blocks, and we understood the relationship between the two. We then navigated to our JavaScript test website and passed in some text to this input field, which we located using the model locator. We then used the binding locator to get the text of the relevant text on the web page and then printed that out to the console log. So in this video we haven't really done a lot of heavy testing, but we've started to understand the building blocks and knowledge needed to actually write these JavaScript Protractor tests. So this video should act as a gateway to writing a lot of these tests going forward. In my next few Protractor videos, we'll be looking at various things such as more locators, we'll be looking at how to write expecs, how to write before and after, page object pattern, and so on. And that's it for this video, folks. Thanks a lot for watching. Hey guys, thanks a lot for watching my video. If you already haven't, hit the subscribe button to stay up to date with my latest videos, which I release every Wednesdays and Sundays. Also, follow me on Twitter and Facebook. Until next time, ciao.